As King George III sings in the Broadway musical Hamilton,
Oceans rise, empires fall.
empires and nations fall. It's been the way of the world since the beginning of civilization. Just ask any pharaoh or Holy Roman Emperor. While not every revolution inspires a Broadway musical, they are full of action, drama, and bloodshed. But the people in power don't go down without a fight, and it often takes a powerful revolution to take them down. This brings us back to the Cold War and how the Iron Curtain eventually fell. Sometimes it takes a single heckler to get the ball rolling. This video from the morning of December 21st, 1989, shows the exact moment that Romanian dictator Nicolae Ceausescu's oppressive reign came to an end. All around him, communist nations are starting to fall, but he is determined to control the situation. So after protests break out against him in the town of Timisoara, Ceausescu buses around 110,000 workers into downtown Bucharest to pose with banners and proclaim their love for him. And at first, everything goes as planned.
Soon as Ceausescu is introduced, he starts his, canned speech, saying the same thing that he said 1,000 times before. Blah, blah, blah. Bullshit.
Și acum trebuie să acționăm în deplină unitate, cu fermitate, împotriva tuturor celor care încearcă să slăbească.
At the first, the people are applauding. You can see that they're applauding, right? And then it's supposed to get quiet. And as things get quiet, somebody yells, "Down with Ceausescu."
Aceasta ca o
There's some screaming in the background. All of a sudden, it starts growing. And so you see in his eyes this disbelief.
Așezați-vă liniștiți! Coboară!
It really shows the relation between fear and hope. There was good reason for fear. But all of a sudden, one person has the audacity to say, no more. Because they hope that somebody else will follow them. And that is the beginning of the revolution in Bucharest.
This is not only a Romanian story, it's the story of authoritarian rule being brought down, not by guns and missiles, but by the voices of young people who have simply had enough. The year 1989 is momentous in world history. 1989 saw a wave of revolutions that crashed through the Iron Curtain, some violent like in Romania, but others peaceful. And collectively, they achieved what many thought was impossible: the end of the Cold War. The city of Berlin was the capital of the Cold War. It was divided between East and West, with 156 kilometers of barbed wire dividers and fences separating capitalist West Berlin from communist East Berlin. You can still see the mark the wall left on the city today. It's even visible from space.
Life under communism was very much like living as a bonsai tree. The party provided the container, the soil, the water, and also the trimming of the bonsai tree regularly. So long as you didn't act against the regime, you could live a nice curated life of a bonsai tree.
There were quite a few important ways in which people were able to live good, happy bonsai lives under communism.
Everybody was entitled to a free education. By and large, it was communism. that eradicated illiteracy in this part of the world. You had free healthcare. When you had to go to the doctor, because it's socialized medicine, you didn't have to pay an arm and a leg. There was this kind of bottom line social welfare system where nobody went hungry.
Sounds pretty great, but there were some serious trade-offs as well.
The conditions of your growth were always closely supervised by the police. Sometimes the police would install microphones in homes of people that they wanted to watch. Whether this happened very often or not is not as important as the fact that we fully believed in that, and that it shaped us and our thinking about ourselves as citizens and in relation to the state. And you could pretend that your life was good because it could look good to you, but you can never grow outside of those limitations.
So what if you saw yourself more like a flowing oak tree, free to make your own choices and suffer your own consequences? Well, your options were limited. You could put your head down and embrace your bonsai tree reality. You could speak out against the system and go to jail. Or you could try to escape and risk getting shot or captured. Which is exactly what tens of thousands of people chose to do through the only gap in the Iron Curtain, West Berlin. By 1961, nearly 20% of East Germany's population had fled through West Berlin. This wasn't ideal for West Germany, but it was devastating for East Germany. And with no physical barrier, it was nearly impossible to stem the flow of people. Until the Soviets, who essentially ran East Germany, came up with a solution: build the wall. On the morning of Sunday, August 13th, 1961, police and members of the East German army surprised the world by closing the border between East and West Berlin. That day became known as Barbed Wire Sunday. East Germans and West Germans woke up that morning to learn that they'd never be able to see their grandmother, their brother, their best friend, anybody who lives on the other side of town again. But it worked. The wall stopped mass migrations. There are countless stories of separations, escapes, and deaths. It's a trauma that the entire city experienced on both sides of the wall.
The President of the United States is dead.
Undisturbed by protests, pop songs, and world events, the wall and the Iron Curtain continued to stand. And then this guy rose to power, Mikhail Gorbachev.
Well, although he came from a rural setting, he went to Moscow University. That was the best university in the Soviet Union. That university was circumscribed by ideology, but people within its walls could speak much more freely. So when he emerged from that university in 1955, he was already a doubter, if not an open dissenter. And then when he began to move up the ranks in the Communist Party, hoping for reform, but encountering stubborn resistance, he began to think, well, maybe we need more reform, not less.
Gorbachev's vision for Russia was a radical one. He dreamt of a world that was not divided between East and West, communism and capitalism, dictatorship and democracy. A world where the USSR could not only be reformed, but integrated into Europe.
To even imagine that and to hope for it was a quite radical thing for him to do.
Gorbachev's complete restructuring of the economy and political system started slowly at first. As the saying goes, Rome wasn't reconstructed, built in a day.
He decided he needed to rein in the Communist Party and reduce its power and replace it with a genuine parliament and an elected president. And that's when he really broke through and began to transform the Soviet Union.
One of the ways Gorbachev democratized the Soviet Union was through a policy of Glasnost, meaning openness. According to Gorbachev, in an effort to increase government transparency, people could now literally criticize their leaders, which was not allowed before.
He allowed things to be said that had only been dreamed.
And when Moscow moved, the 15 Soviet republics that made up the Soviet Union moved with it. On top of that, the Soviet Union was the de facto leader of the military alliance called the Warsaw Pact. So what was decided in Moscow was enforced everywhere. But around this time, Gorbachev also claimed he would stop using force to control the nations within the Warsaw Pact. Gorbachev jokingly called this policy the Sinatra Doctrine, after Frank Sinatra's popular song My Way.
And now the end is near, and so I face the final day.
1989 was truly a year of miracles. Every day was filled with hope. You could write freely, you could talk freely, you could discuss freely. But the tension in 1989 was that most people, they believed that the Soviets would use force to keep the Allies within the pact.
There were quite a few people in the West, in Washington and elsewhere, who didn't believe Gorbachev. There were people who thought, well, he's just a smiley-faced communist. He's trying to get us to lay down our arms. But he wasn't.
Very gradually, starting in 1989, young people in Eastern Europe started pushing the limits of what was allowed.
The first free elections in the socialist bloc took place in 1989.
I lived with my family in Moscow, and I couldn't believe what was happening right before my eyes.
But not everyone in Russia was on the same page as Gorbachev.
Eastern Europe was seen by many, especially people who fought in World War II, including my father, as a territory that the Soviets controlled legitimately. People said, these lands are soaked with the blood of the Soviet soldiers. We cannot give them away. Because the Soviets liberated Eastern Europe from Hitler. But when Gorbachev is even now accused by old thinkers that he gave away Eastern Europe, he responds, to whom did I give it to? I gave Hungary to the Hungarians. I gave Czechoslovakia to Czechs and Slovaks. I gave Poland to the Poles.
But what about the wall? People sometimes associate the fall of the wall with Ronald Reagan because of this catchy moment.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
But the truth is that it isn't this dramatic statement that got rid of the wall for good. Instead, it's a boring one from a person the world had never even heard of. This is Günter Schabowski. He's an East German official who serves as a spokesman for the East German government. East Germany being the Soviet-allied communist side. After an influx of protests, officials decided to give in a little and loosen border restrictions. Here's the plan. Günter will read an official statement explaining that East Germans can now apply for travel visas in an orderly fashion tomorrow. End of story. But Günter was actually on a smoke break when the specifics were discussed. So when he's handed the statement that he hasn't read and doesn't fully understand, he improvises and changes history.
Allerdings ist heute, soviel ich weiß, eine Entscheidung getroffen worden,
die es jedem Bürger der DDR möglich macht, über Grenzübergangspunkte der DDR auszureisen. Bitte? Ab sofort? Also Genossen, mir ist das hier also mitgeteilt worden. Ständige Ausreisen können über alle Grenzübergangsstellen der DDR zur BRD erfolgen. Wann tritt das? Das tritt nach meiner Kenntnis ist das sofort. Unverzüglich.
Herr Schabowski, was wird mit dem Berliner Mauer jetzt geschehen?
The story is picked up on the news that night, and the rest is history. The border guards have shoot-to-kill orders, but they're quickly outnumbered by thousands of Berliners swarming the checkpoints, claiming that the news told them they're free. Eventually, the guards let the masses through. For the first time in almost 30 years, East Berliners flooded through the checkpoints. They're greeted by West Berliners with flowers and champagne. That is how the Berlin Wall came down.
As it happened, I was in Berlin at the time that the Berlin Wall first opened. And here were all these people streaming through this wall in order to see the big city and see the lights and see the department stores with all their clothes. But the smell, the overwhelming smell in the air, was a cream of broccoli soup, which the West Berliners were doling out in cups to anyone who came by. We had a cup too, just to see what it was like.
I learned later that Gorbachev's advisors did not wake him to tell him that it had fallen. I think they sensed that he not only didn't view it as a disaster, but welcomed it as part of the end of the Cold War.
It's the Germans who tore down the wall, breached the wall, went through the Brandenburg Gate to freedom, and Gorbachev's real achievement is that at that moment, he ordered the Soviet troops to stay in their barracks and not make any provocative moves.
The image of young men standing up on top of the wall was something that I had not even imagined as somebody who grew up in Eastern Europe during that time. It really was a powerful visual symbol that sent chills down my spine because I could see myself in them.
A few weeks after the wall falls, Gorbachev and the new US President George H.W. Bush agree to meet for a summit to get on the same page. And I bet you can guess the name. Gorbachev and Bush meet for 2 days on warships anchored in choppy seas at Malta. And nothing important is decided, but it's the symbolism that counts.
As I leave Malta, I am optimistic that as the West works patiently together and increasingly cooperates with the Soviet Union, we can realize a lasting peace and transform the East-West relationship to one of enduring cooperation.
By 1991, the Soviet Union is in a tough spot, economically, politically, domestically. By December of 1991, 12 out of 15 Soviet republics have declared independence. Then on Christmas Day, Gorbachev hands over the nuclear launch codes and resigns. The next day, the Soviet flag is lowered over the Kremlin, and the Russian Federation's flag is lifted. The Soviet Union was dissolved. As great as it would be to have the story end here, it doesn't. And as great as it would also be to say that the Soviet Union dissolved and turned into a democracy with a thriving free market economy, that's not what happens either. There was at least one new development everyone could enjoy: American businesses like McDonald's and Pizza Hut. Gorbachev himself even starred in a commercial.
За Горбачева!
За Горбачева!
From Pizza Hut.
Everybody in the United States, me including, believed that the end of the Cold War just happened. The liberal ideas won. There is no possibility of going back to the old days. And so the democratic model and capitalism are applicable across the entire world. And the United States was actively trying to help Russia reform using this model. And Russia was very resistant. And by 1995-96, people saw that democracy did not benefit them at all. In fact, they saw that democracy brought a lot of corruption. Democracy brought fixed elections. Almost every week I think back to 1989, and I can't believe we did not use this opportunity. All of us, we were blind, we were complacent.
It's, I think, tempting for all of us to say, well, what difference can I make? I'm just an ordinary person. If we think about the end of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Cold War didn't end through the use of, I don't know, massive bombing or an artillery barrage. It really ended, in a sense, through ideas. The power of people, ultimately, was decisive.
I mean, I remember as an 8-year-old the end of World War II and how just delirious everyone was. As an 8-year-old, I didn't really quite understand what it was they were so happy about. My entire life had covered the Cold War years. I was just out of college during the Cuban Missile Crisis. I was in the Air Force during one of the crises between Kennedy and Khrushchev, the so-called Berlin crisis. I had not only lived through it and studied it, but I'd felt it, felt the pressure, felt the terror. And to see these people released as if from prison, I certainly understood as a young man in Berlin in 1989.
The story of the Cold War is a story of walls going up and walls coming down. The story of how the world could have ended in a moment, but didn't. It reminds us again and again that humankind is capable of amazing good and terrifying evil. But what good is learning our history if we can't learn from it?
This moment shows the power of the people in a way that is palpable. So you can see in real time, in essence, what democracy is about. It's about people standing up. It has real power. I mean, that is remarkable, that to see something like that happen. It gives me hope for us.